The ruins of Drax 7 stretched out like the carcass of some long-dead beast, its remains gnawed on by scavengers. Once a thriving industrial hub, the planet had fallen into decay, the victim of its own greed. The great Selvan conglomerate had built its empire here, manufacturing weapons, cybernetics, and all manner of technological abominations. But when war came knocking, when rival factions bled the stars red with their endless hunger for power, Drax 7 became an afterthought. It had been bombed, blockaded, abandoned. What was left now was a graveyard of industry where only the desperate remained. Mercenaries, slavers, and those too poor or too foolish to escape before everything collapsed. And yet, even in this dying world, Ronan Carter walked without fear. Dressed in a reinforced tactical jacket, his weapons strapped securely to his thigh and back, he moved like a man who owned the shadows. His expression was unreadable beneath the scruff of his unshaven jaw, but his eyes, sharp and alert, missed nothing. He wasn't here by choice. He never was. A job had brought him to this forsaken world. Fuel cells, stolen from a black market transport, were rumored to be hidden somewhere in this sector. Someone had paid him to retrieve them, no questions asked, simple enough. A quick in and out. Except Drax 7 had a way of pulling people into its misery. That's when he heard the voice. A weak, ragged plea for help. Ronan stopped. His first instinct was to ignore it. He wasn't a hero, never had been. He did what was necessary, nothing more. But something about the sound, it wasn't just weak, it was resigned, like whoever was calling out wasn't expecting an answer. He exhaled through his nose. Every damn time, he muttered before turning toward the sound. The building he entered had once been a processing plant, judging by the rusted conveyor belts and shattered containment units. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and decay. Something lurched in the darkness, skittering away as his boots crunched over broken glass. Then he saw it. A cage. It was crude and rusted, the metal bars barely holding together, yet still strong enough to serve its cruel purpose. Inside, hunched in the filth, was a figure. She was small, fragile, and bound in shackles far too large for her slender wrists. Her skin, a deep, unnatural green, was marred with scars, some fresh, others ancient. A mane of tangled silver hair spilled over her face, hiding most of her features. Her clothing was little more than rags, torn and filthy, offering no protection against the cold. But it was her eyes that made Ronan pause. They were not human. Large, almond-shaped, and glowing with an eerie, pale gold light, they stared at him, wide with shock. "You?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You're not one of them." Ronan tilted his head. "Nope." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then she shrank back, pressing herself against the bars as if expecting a blow. Ronan frowned. That reaction told him everything. This wasn't just some unfortunate soul who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, she had been here for a while, and whoever had put her in this cage had taught her one thing: expect pain. "Relax," he said, raising a hand in a show of non-threat. "Not here to hurt you." Her glowing eyes searched his face, as if trying to detect the lie. A beat passed. Then, barely above a whisper, "People Kaziri." "What?" She swallowed, her throat dry. "My name, it's Kaziri." Ronan exhaled, his breath misting in the cold air. "All right, Kaziri, who put you in here?" She hesitated. When she finally spoke, it was barely audible. "Slavers. They said I wasn't worth selling." Something ugly twisted in Ronan's gut. Slavery wasn't uncommon in the outer systems, but this? Leaving someone behind to rot? That was a level of cruelty that even the worst scum didn't usually bother with. He stepped forward. Kaziri flinched. Ronan sighed, running a hand through his dark, unruly hair. "Yeah, she's been through hell. I'm gonna break those chains, all right?" he said. She stared at him, her breath shallow. She swallowed. You can't. They're reinforced." Ronan wrapped his hands around the chains and pulled. Metal groaned in protest. Kaziri sucked in a sharp breath, expecting the same thing that had happened every time she tried to break them herself: failure. Instead, there was a sharp crack as the chains snapped like brittle bone. She gasped, blinking rapidly as the weight on her wrists suddenly vanished. Ronan rolled his shoulders. What kind of idiot uses cheap alloys on restraints? Kaziri stared at him, her expression caught between disbelief and something that almost looked like fear. "This impossible," she whispered. Ronan arched an eyebrow. "Not really." He didn't explain further. Kaziri, despite her exhaustion, was still trying to make sense of what just happened. No one breaks reinforced shackles with their bare hands. No one. Unless the rumors about humans were true. "You're real," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Ronan frowned. "What?" "I thought." She swallowed. "Humans. I thought you were just stories, something the elders whispered about." Ronan sighed. "Yeah, well, surprise, we exist." She shuddered, overwhelmed by something he couldn't name. Ronan crouched beside her, eyes scanning her frail form. "Can you walk?" Kaziri tried. She barely made it to her knees before her strength failed her. She pitched forward and would have hit the ground if Ronan hadn't caught her in one swift motion. She gasped. Ronan held her easily, her weight nearly non-existent in his arms. For a moment, Kaziri didn't move, didn't breathe. No one had ever carried her like this, not with care, not without malice. She looked up at him, her gold eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Where are you taking me?" "Somewhere that isn't here," he said simply. And for the first time in her life, Kaziri felt safe. Because a human had found her, and everything was about to change. Kaziri woke to warmth. It took her a moment to register the sensation, to convince herself she wasn't dreaming. The heat wrapped around her like a protective cocoon, easing the ache in her bones. For the first time in... how long had it been? She felt neither cold nor pain pressing in from all sides. She blinked, adjusting to the dim lighting. She wasn't in a cage anymore. The hard metal bars had been replaced by a real bed, albeit a stiff one, with coarse but clean sheets. A soft hum vibrated beneath her, rhythmic, steady. A ship. Her breath hitched. She tried to sit up, but her muscles rebelled. Weakness clung to her like chains, refusing to let go. "Easy," a voice said. Kaziri flinched. Her gaze darted toward the source, the human. Ronan Carter leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with unreadable eyes. He was no longer wearing his jacket, leaving only a dark, fitted undershirt that exposed the strength in his arms. A blaster sat holstered on his hip, close enough to draw in an instant, but relaxed enough to suggest he wasn't expecting trouble. "You're safe," he added. Kaziri's mind screamed at her not to trust him. Yet, she was here, alive, not locked away. That had to mean something. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "Where?" "My ship," Ronan said simply. "The Black Star. Decent little transport, nothing fancy." Kaziri forced her lips to move. "You took me? You weren't exactly in a position to walk out on your own." She clenched her fingers into the blanket. "Why?" Ronan's expression didn't shift. "Figured leaving you there was a shitty thing to do." She blinked. That was it? No grand explanation, no hidden motive, just because? That didn't make sense. "You didn't have to," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nope. And what?" Ronan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I didn't plan on adopting a stray, but I don't make a habit of walking past dying people and pretending I didn't see them. You think that's weird, fine, but that's how humans do things." Kaziri had no answer for that. She had spent her life surrounded by cruelty, by those who saw kindness as weakness, who took pleasure in others' suffering. No one had ever helped her without expecting something in return. No one. Until now. She studied him, searching for the lie, for the moment he would drop the act and reveal his real intentions. But all she found was exhaustion, the kind that settled into a man's bones after too many fights and too little sleep. "How do you feel?" Ronan asked. Kaziri hesitated. "I don't know." That was the truth. Her body still ached, but it was a different pain, a healing one, not a dying one. The hunger that had gnawed at her insides was dulled, not gone but manageable. And there was warmth. She hadn't felt warmth in so long. "Figured you'd need food," Ronan said. "Didn't know what your kind eats, so I guessed. Made soup. Can't go wrong with soup." She stared. "He cooked?" He jerked his thumb toward the table near the bed. A steaming bowl sat there, the scent making her stomach tighten painfully. Her body wanted it, but her mind hesitated. She knew how this went. Food was a bargaining chip. You ate only if you pleased your captor. Ronan must have caught her expression because he sighed. "It's not poisoned. It's not a trick. You eat because you're hungry. End of story." Kaziri's hands trembled as she reached for the bowl. The moment the warm liquid touched her tongue, she nearly wept. It was bland, too salty, and the vegetables were overcooked, but it was real. She ate quickly, her body demanding more than she could give. "Slow down," Ronan said, watching her with something close to amusement. "You'll make yourself sick." Kaziri forced herself to take smaller bites, but her hands refused to stop shaking. Ronan leaned against the doorway again, arms crossed. "So, what's your story?" She paused. He was asking about her? Not demanding, not prying, just asking? She swallowed. "You already know I was a slave." Ronan nodded. "My people," she continued slowly, "the Zairi. We're gone. Hunted. Exterminated." His jaw tightened. "By who?" She let out a bitter breath. "No one knows. Or if they do, they don't care. We were labeled a genetic aberration." Ronan frowned. "Dangerous how?" Kaziri hesitated. "My kind, we were different," she said. "We could see things others couldn't, feel things. Some called it instinct, others called it unnatural." Ronan processed that. "Some kind of psychic ability?" Kaziri shrugged. "I never got the chance to understand it. Before I could even learn what I was, they took me." Ronan leaned back, his gaze unreadable. "How long?" "Since I was a child." Silence stretched between them. Ronan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Damn!" That was all he said. No false sympathy, no empty platitudes, just, "Damn." Kaziri didn't know why, but that made her feel lighter. She licked her lips, the taste of the soup still lingering. "You're not what I expected," Ronan snorted. "Yeah, I get that a lot." She tilted her head. "You're human. Why aren't there more of you?" Ronan's expression darkened slightly. "We're not exactly the galaxy's favorite species," he said. "We don't fit neatly into the civilized boxes everyone else built. Too unpredictable, too stubborn, too human." Kaziri considered that. It made sense. She had heard whispers of humans, wild, untamed creatures, creatures that didn't break. She believed it now. Ronan pushed off the wall. "Get some rest. You need it." Kaziri hesitated. "You're not locking me in?" Something flickered across his face. "You're free, Kaziri. What you do with that is up to you." He turned, heading toward the door. Before he left, Kaziri spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Ronan paused, then gave a small nod. As the door slid shut, Kaziri curled beneath the blanket, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. For the first time in her life, she had a choice. and it terrified her. The warning hit Ronan's console like a punch to the gut. A bright red bounty notice flashed across the screen, the words bold and undeniable. Bounty issued Ronan Carter 25000, credits dead or alive. He swore under his breath, rubbing the tension from his forehead. This was worse than he'd expected. A bounty this high wasn't just a punishment, it was a message. The slavers wanted everyone to know that stealing from them wasn't just a crime, it was suicide. Ronan shut the alert down, sighing as he leaned back in his seat. Drag 7 had been a risk, but he hadn't expected this level of fallout. He had pissed off dangerous people before, but a 250,000 bounty? That wasn't standard revenge. Someone out there wanted him dead, and they wanted it badly. He barely had time to process before he heard the faint rustling behind him. Kaziri. She stood in the doorway of the cockpit, her silver hair still damp from the shower, wearing one of his oversized shirts. The bruises on her arms had faded slightly, but her golden eyes held a flicker of concern. "You're frowning again," she said quietly. Ronan let out a tired chuckle. "You keep saying that like it's a crime." Kaziri stepped closer. "It's different this time." Ronan didn't reply. She was too perceptive. Even after everything, after a life of being treated as less than nothing, she could still read people. That was dangerous, but also useful. Instead of answering, he spun his chair to face her. "Someone put a bounty on me," he said. Her fingers twitched at her sides. "Because of me?" "No, because of them." His voice was firm. "They don't like losing. That's all this is." She shook her head, struggling to meet his gaze. "They'll come for you now." "They can try," Ronan muttered. Kaziri stared at him, her golden eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. "You're not afraid," she whispered. "Fear doesn't help, but it keeps you alive." Ronan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Listen, I've been in worse situations. I get out of them the same way every time, by not panicking. If I stop to be scared, I'm already dead." Kaziri chewed on her lip, digesting his words. Then, quieter, she said, "Humans don't make sense." Ronan smirked. "We get that a lot." Kaziri hesitated, as if debating whether to say something else, but before she could, alarms blared. Ronan's attention snapped to the console. His stomach sank. "What?" Kaziri asked, instantly alert. "The company." He tapped a few keys, pulling up the long-range scanner. 3 incoming vessels. Fast. Kaziri's breath caught. Slavers? Maybe, or bounty hunters. Ronan's jaw tightened. Doesn't matter. The Black Star's sensors pulsed, analyzing the incoming ships. Gunships. Not some random gang looking for easy money. Professionals. Kaziri took a step back, her entire body going rigid. "They found us that fast?" Ronan's mind raced. Someone must have leaked their trajectory. A bounty this fresh shouldn't have drawn hunters this quickly. Unless someone had been waiting for an excuse to kill him. Ronan killed the ship's beacon, cutting off their location feed. It wouldn't stop the hunters, but it would slow them down. A warning shot streaked past the viewport, a pulse blast too close for comfort. Ronan gritted his teeth. They weren't interested in talking. "Hold on," he muttered. He slammed the throttle forward. The Black Star dove hard, engines screaming as it veered off course. Plasma rounds cut through the dark, barely missing them. Kaziri gripped the back of his chair. "Are you insane?" "Completely," Ronan shot back. The enemy ships pursued, their thrusters glowing like angry stars. Kaziri's fingers tightened. "What's the plan?" "Make them regret this." Another barrage of plasma rained down. The ship rocked violently. Ronan swore under his breath. "Shields won't hold forever," he muttered. "And then do something." Ronan's hands flew over the controls. He adjusted stabilizers, cut the thrusters for half a second, just long enough to let gravity pull them down. The enemy ships weren't expecting it. One of them overcompensated, veering too hard to correct course. It spun out. "Oh, down," Ronan muttered. Kaziri stared at the wreckage on the screen. "How did you—" "They always overcorrect," Ronan said simply. The remaining two ships weren't deterred. They stayed locked onto him, relentless. Kaziri's breathing hitched. "They're still on us." "I noticed." A pulse round grazed the hull, sending a warning light flashing across the console. Ronan yanked the controls, sending the Black Star into a sudden, brutal flip. Kaziri nearly flew out of her seat. The enemy ships shot past them. Now they were the ones being hunted. Ronan fired. Twin plasma cannons roared to life. One of the enemy ships exploded, torn apart by the sheer force of the blast. The last ship panicked. Ronan could tell by the way they started jerking erratically, desperate to escape. Too late. Another precise shot. Another wreck. Silence. The Black Star drifted, smoke curling from the engines, but still intact. Kaziri stared at the destruction outside the viewport. "You just took down 3 ships." "Yep. By yourself. Technically you were here yelling at me, so that counts as teamwork." Kaziri let out a breathless laugh, a real one. Ronan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" She hesitated, then nodded. He studied her for a moment longer before leaning back in his seat. "Welcome to life with me, kid. It's never boring." Kaziri's gaze drifted back to the debris floating outside the viewport. For the first time in her life, she wasn't helpless. And she had a human to thank for that. The ship was still vibrating from the battle. The scent of overheated circuits and scorched metal lingered in the air. Ronan exhaled sharply, fingers drumming against the console. The Black Star had survived the fight, but she was wounded, just like him. Kaziri sat across from him in the cockpit, eyes fixed on the viewport. The wreckage of the bounty hunter's ships still floated like broken bones against the void. Her expression was unreadable, but Ronan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled into her borrowed sleeves. "You all right?" he asked. She blinked, as if pulled from deep thought. "I don't know," she admitted. Ronan leaned back in his chair. "You're free now." Kaziri's fingers twitched. Free. The word felt foreign. For as long as she could remember, she had belonged to someone else. Chains, cages, orders barked at her in voices she never dared disobey. And now? Now she was sitting on a smuggler's ship, alive because a human had decided she was worth saving. The universe didn't work like that. She looked at him, studying the way he moved. So casual, so unbothered. As if nearly dying in space was just another day for him. "You risked your life," she said, voice quiet but firm. Ronan shrugged. "It's what I do." Kaziri tilted her head. "Why?" "Because someone had to." She frowned. "That's not an answer." Ronan ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling. "Fine. You want to know the truth? I don't have a good reason. I saw you in that cage and it pissed me off. I don't like seeing people in chains. That's it." Kaziri studied him, searching for the deception. There was none. "You're an idiot," she muttered. Ronan smirked. "Most people agree." A warning alarm blared, pulling his attention back to the screen. The ship's scanners were picking up movement. Kaziri straightened. "What now?" Ronan's fingers flew over the controls. "We've got company." "More bounty hunters?" Ronan shook his head. "No." "Worse." The console screen displayed a new reading. Not small fighters like before. Something bigger. A cruiser. Kaziri's stomach twisted. Slavers. Ronan's jaw tightened. "Yeah." The ship lurched violently as a gravitational tether latched onto the hull, yanking them into forced docking. The Black Star's engines whined in protest, but there was no escaping this time. "They're boarding us," Ronan muttered. Kaziri's hands clenched into fists. She had spent years being hauled from one prison to another. She refused to go back. "Without a fight," she growled. Ronan glanced at her, surprised. Then he grinned. "That's the spirit." The ship shuddered as the docking clamps engaged. A loud metallic clang reverberated through the hull. Ronan stood, rolling his shoulders. "All right, kid. You ever shoot a gun before?" Kaziri hesitated. "No." "Figures." He tossed her a compact energy pistol. "Point and pull the trigger. Don't miss." Kaziri caught it, surprised by the weight. "Stay behind cover," Ronan said, pulling his shotgun from its sling. The weapon hummed as it powered up, blue light pulsing along its barrel. "And if you see an opening, take it." Kaziri swallowed, nodding. The ship's airlock hissed open. A storm of boots and gunfire crashed into the room. The first slaver through the door barely had time to react before Ronan's shotgun roared. The blast sent him flying backward, crashing into his allies. Kaziri dove behind the control console, heart pounding. Ronan moved like a predator, using the tight quarters to his advantage. He fired, then ducked, reloading with practiced efficiency. Kaziri's grip on the pistol tightened. She wasn't useless. Not anymore. Taking a deep breath, she leaned out of cover and fired. The shot went wide, slamming into a bulkhead instead of the enemy. A slaver spotted her. He grinned cruelly, raising his rifle. Kaziri's blood ran cold. Before he could fire, Ronan was on him. He closed the distance in an instant, grabbing the slaver's gun and twisting. The weapon clattered to the ground. Ronan's fist collided with the slaver's jaw, sending him crashing against the bulkhead. Kaziri stared, breathing heavily. "Better aim next time," Ronan muttered, stepping over the unconscious man. Kaziri gritted her teeth. "I don't miss twice." She ducked as another slaver took a shot at her. This time, when she returned fire, she didn't hesitate. The energy blast hit its mark, sending the slaver staggering backward. Something inside Kaziri shifted. She wasn't a victim anymore. She refused to be. The last remaining slaver tried to retreat, backing toward the airlock. Ronan cracked his knuckles. "Not happening." He grabbed a fallen plasma grenade from one of the bodies, primed it, and tossed it. The slaver's eyes widened. "Wait." The grenade detonated, sending a shockwave through the docking bridge. The remaining enemy was thrown backward, disappearing in a cloud of smoke. Silence followed. Kaziri stared at the carnage, chest rising and falling rapidly. Ronan leaned against the console, shotgun resting on his shoulder. "Well, that was fun." Kaziri turned to him, expression unreadable. "You're insane." Ronan grinned. "You're welcome." She didn't respond. Instead, she walked past him, standing over one of the fallen slavers. Her fingers curled into a fist. They had hunted her, owned her, treated her like a thing. And now, they were nothing. Ronan watched her carefully. He saw the rage in her eyes, the fire that hadn't been there before. "You all right?" he asked. Kaziri exhaled, forcing herself to breathe. "But you won't be." She looked at him, something fierce and determined flickering behind her golden eyes. "Yeah," she said, "I will be." Ronan nodded, pleased. "Good. Now let's get the hell out of here before more of them show up." Kaziri followed him back to the cockpit, her hands steady now. For the first time, she wasn't running. She was fighting back. The black star drifted through the vast emptiness of space, far from the wreckage of the slaver ship. The adrenaline of the fight had faded, leaving behind only exhaustion and silence. The dim cockpit lights cast long shadows over the controls, flickering as if sharing in the ship's fatigue. Ronan sat slumped in the pilot's chair, pressing a cloth against his left side, where a fresh wound bled through his shirt. The slaver's parting shot had grazed him, leaving a deep, burning gash just above his ribs. It wasn't fatal, but it hurt like hell. Across from him, Kaziri watched with narrowed eyes. Her grip on the pistol had loosened, but tension still lingered in her shoulders. She wasn't shaking anymore. "You're hurt," she said. Not the worst I've had. Ronan winced, peeling the blood-soaked fabric from his skin. I'll live. Kazi stood abruptly. Without a word, she disappeared down the corridor, her bare feet light against the cold metal floor. Ronan let out a slow breath, rolling his head against the chair. He was so damn tired. A minute later she returned, a medkit clutched in her hands. Ronan blinked. Didn't take you for a nurse. Kazari didn't respond. She knelt beside him, popping open the case and rummaging through the supplies with quick, practiced hands. Her movements were precise, almost too familiar. "Heard you learn first aid?" he asked. Kaziri hesitated, then muttered, "Slaves are taught to mend their owners before themselves." Ronan's stomach twisted. Kaziri ignored his silence, pulling out a small vial. "This will burn." "Great." Before he could brace himself, she poured the antiseptic directly onto the wound. Ronan hissed a sharp curse, his muscles locking from the pain. Kaziri didn't flinch. "Told you." Ronan let out a strained breath. "Remind me not to piss you off." She gave him a look. "I don't think you know how to do that." Ronan chuckled, the sound rough but genuine. She was getting comfortable. That was a good sign. Kazi worked in silence, pressing a gauze pad firmly over the wound before wrapping a bandage around his torso. Her hands, though delicate, carried an undeniable strength, the kind forged through hardship. Ronan watched her, studying the furrow of her brow, the way her lips pressed together in quiet concentration. She had been through hell, but she was still standing. When she finished, she sat back on her heels. "It'll hold." Ronan flexed experimentally. "Not bad, kid." Kaziri's gaze flicked up to meet his. "I'm not a kid." Something in her voice made him pause. There was no anger, no sharpness, just a quiet insistence. Ronan nodded. "Fair enough." Kaziri exhaled, tucking the supplies back into the medkit. Her hands lingered over the case before she spoke again. "Are you always like this?" Ronan frowned. "Like what?" "Risking yourself for others." He scoffed. "You think I do this all the time?" Kaziri tilted her head. "You fight like someone who doesn't expect to live long." Ronan went still. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Damn, you don't hold back, do you?" Kaziri studied him, her golden eyes bright against the dim cockpit glow. "You saved me. You didn't have to, so why?" Ronan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just sick of watching good people get crushed by bad ones." Kaziri frowned. "You don't know if I'm good." "I don't know if I am either," Ronan admitted. Kaziri looked away. Silence stretched between them again, but this time it was different, less tense, more uncertain. Then, sideline, "I thought humans were myths." Ronan arched a brow. "Myths?" She nodded. "The stories I heard, they made humans sound like ghosts, monsters that didn't break, that didn't die like the rest of us." Ronan smirked. "Well, the not dying part's a work in progress." Kaziri let out something close to a chuckle. "You're different from what I expected." Ronan leaned back in his chair. "What did you expect?" Kaziri hesitated, then admitted, "Someone cruel." Ronan's smirk faded. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You're free now. No one's coming to take you back." Kaziri didn't answer. Instead, she looked out the viewport, staring at the distant stars. "Do you ever wonder what comes next?" she asked. Ronan sighed. "All the damn time." Kaziri turned to him. "What do you want, Ronan?" He blinked. No one had ever asked him that before. The answer should have been easy. Money, freedom, a ship that didn't fall apart every other job. But for the first time, none of those things felt right. "I don't know," he admitted. Kaziri's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected that answer. Then she nodded. "Me neither." Ronan looked at her, really looked at her, the way the starlight reflected in her eyes, the way she sat closer now than she had before. Something shifted between them. Kaziri broke the silence first. "Where do we go now?" Ronan's gaze lingered on her before he smirked. "Anywhere we damn well please." Kaziri breathed in, then out. For the first time, the future didn't seem so terrifying. And for the first time, she wasn't alone. The black star glided through the black void, a shadow against the endless sea of stars. Ronan sat at the controls, scanning the readouts with attention that hadn't left his body since the bounty had gone public. He knew what was coming. Trouble. It always found him. Kaziri sat across from him, her golden eyes locked on the viewport. The ship's dim light cast soft shadows across her features. She wasn't the same girl he had pulled from that cage. She sat straighter, her hands steady, her gaze sharper. "You're thinking too hard again," she said. Ronan smirked. "You keep saying that like it's a bad habit." Kaziri arched a brow. "It is. People who think too much usually end up regretting something." "Yeah? What do people who don't think end up doing?" She smirked. "Usually dead." Ronan chuckled. "Good thing I fall somewhere in the middle." The ship's proximity alarm blared. Kaziri's smirk vanished. She turned to the console, her fingers curling against the seat. "What is it?" Ronan's jaw tightened. "Company." He tapped a few buttons. The scanner pulsed, displaying the unmistakable shape of a warship emerging from hyperspace. Kaziri inhaled sharply. "That's not bounty hunters." "Nope," Ronan muttered. It was something worse. The Empress's Hand, a private warship belonging to one of the most powerful syndicates in the galaxy. The same people who had wiped out the Zairi and declared Kaziri's entire species a mistake. Ronan cursed. "I was hoping we'd have more time." Kaziri's fingers dug into the seat. "They found me." "They were always going to," Ronan said. "I just didn't think they'd send a whole damn warship to collect you." Kaziri swallowed. "What do they want with me?" Ronan didn't answer right away. He studied the ship's insignia, the gleaming emblem on its side. A black sun eclipsing a golden world. "You're more than just a runaway slave," he said finally, "and I think you know that." Kaziri hesitated, something flickering behind her expression. A transmission came through. A calm, elegant voice filled the cockpit. "Ronan Carter, you are harboring stolen property. Stand down and prepare for boarding, or we will rip your ship apart." Kaziri stiffened. Ronan rolled his shoulders. "You'd think slavers could at least pretend to be polite." Kazuri's breathing turned shallow. "They'll take me back. They'll—" Ronan reached over, gripping her wrist firmly. "No, they won't." Her breath hitched. "You're not property," he said, his voice steady, firm. "And I don't hand over people. Ever." The warship's turrets powered up, glowing like a storm waiting to break. Kaziri tore her gaze away from the viewport. "We can't win against that." Ronan smirked. "Good thing I don't plan on fighting fair." He slammed the throttle, sending the Black Star into a sharp dive. The ship's engine screamed in protest, cutting dangerously close to the warship's underbelly. The enemy fired. Blue energy streaked past the hull, missing by inches. Kaziri clutched the seat, her pulse racing. "This is your plan?" More like a very enthusiastic improvisation. Ronan jerked the controls, spinning the ship into a tight roll as another blast barely grazed them. The Black Star was fast, but not invincible. "They're locking onto us," Kaziri warned. "Not for long," Ronan growled. He flicked a switch. The ship's countermeasures activated, deploying a cluster of electromagnetic mines directly into the warship's path. A beat of silence. Then impact. The mines detonated in a flash of blinding blue light, disrupting the warship's tracking systems. The scanners flickered wildly, the massive ship struggling to adjust. Kaziri's eyes widened. "You just blinded them." "Temporarily," Ronan muttered. We need a real exit plan. Kaziri's mind raced. The warship wouldn't stay disoriented for long. They needed more than a head start. She turned to Ronan, something fierce in her expression. "Take us into the asteroid field." Ronan blinked. "The hell kind of idea is that?" "They won't follow. Because it's a death trap." Kaziri's jaw tightened. "Not for me." Ronan studied her. Kaziri wasn't asking, she was deciding. Something shifted between them. Ronan exhaled. "All right. Hope you're right." He yanked the controls. The Black Star veered hard, diving toward the jagged belt of asteroids ahead. Chunks of frozen rock and debris spun wildly, colliding into each other like angry gods waging war. The warship hesitated. Kaziri watched, her fingers gripping the console. "They're not moving." Ronan arched a brow. "Told you, they're not dumb enough to follow us." Kaziri let out a shaky breath. "Then we're safe." "For now," Ronan muttered. The warship loomed in the distance, unable to pursue. The asteroid field was too unpredictable, its gravity wells and shifting debris a natural fortress. Ronan leaned back, letting out a low chuckle. "Well, that was fun." Kaziri didn't laugh. She stared at the warship, her golden eyes burning with something new. "They'll never stop," she whispered. Ronan watched her carefully. "Then we don't stop either." Kaziri turned to him. For the first time, she wasn't afraid. For the first time, she was angry. Ronan smirked. "You got that look." Kaziri raised a brow. "What look?" "The one people get when they stop running." Kaziri inhaled slowly. Then softly, "I want to fight back." Ronan nodded, unsurprised. "Thought you might say that." A long silence stretched between them. Then Kaziri did something she never would have done before. She reached out. Not out of fear, not out of desperation, but out of something deeper. Ronan felt the brush of her fingertips against his hand. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a problem the galaxy would never see coming. The Black Star floated at the edge of the asteroid field, battered but standing. The warship behind them remained distant, a looming reminder that this fight was far from over. Kaziri stared at it from the viewport, her golden eyes steady. A week ago she would have trembled at the thought of facing them. A week ago she would have been running, waiting for the inevitable. Now she wasn't afraid. She turned to Ronan, who was seated at the controls, fingers drumming lazily against the console. His wound was still healing, but he acted like it was nothing. He always did. "You really don't feel pain like normal people, do you?" she asked. Ronan smirked. "Pain's a great motivator." Kaziri rolled her eyes, but smiled. His smirk faded slightly as he glanced at the scanner. "They're waiting." "For what?" "For us to slip up, for backup, for orders from whoever sent them." Kaziri exhaled. "They won't stop, will they?" Ronan shook his head. "Not until you're dead or back in a cage." Her fingers clenched into fists. She had spent her entire life being someone's property, waiting for the next master, the next set of chains. She had been powerless, a pawn in someone else's war. Not anymore. "We need to fight back," she said. Ronan studied her for a long moment. "That's not just anger talking, is it?" Kaziri met his gaze, her jaw tight. "No." Ronan leaned back, crossing his arms. "All right then. You want to start a war?" "I want to finish one." Ronan chuckled. "Damn, I was hoping you'd say that." He stood, rolling his shoulders. "First step, we find out why they want you so badly. If they're willing to throw a warship after us, you're more than just an escaped slave." Kaziri frowned. "I've told you everything I know." Ronan shook his head. "Not everything, not yet." Kaziri hesitated. There were gaps in her memory. She had always assumed it was trauma, the result of too much pain, too many years spent locked away. But what if it was something else? All right, she said, where do we start? Ronan grinned. With someone who hates these bastards as much as we do. They landed on Vorinth 9, a hidden moon deep in neutral space. It wasn't much, just a dusty rock with barely enough atmosphere to sustain life. But it had something more important than air. A contact. The man waiting for them in the underground outpost was old, scarred by war, with cybernetic arms that looked like they had seen 1,000 battles. Ronan Carter, he grumbled, you really know how to piss off the right people. Ronan smirked. Keeps life interesting, Varric. Varric turned his one organic eye toward Kayseri, his expression shifting. He didn't see a runaway slave. He saw something more. You're one of them, he murmured. Kayseri stiffened. What of what? Varric exhaled. The Zayae weren't just hunted. They were erased. Someone out there decided they were a threat to the balance of power. Kayseri swallowed. Why? Varric's cybernetic fingers tapped against the table. Because your people weren't just different. They were evolutionary perfection. They saw patterns where others didn't. They had instincts that couldn't be trained, abilities that couldn't be controlled, and someone decided that was too dangerous. Kazi felt the words settle into her bones, the weight of them making it hard to breathe. "Are me alive?" she asked. Varric sighed. Maybe you were meant to be studied. Maybe they were waiting for you to grow into whatever power they feared. His gaze darkened. Or maybe you were meant to die quietly, forgotten, like the rest. Ronan's jaw tightened. Well, that plans out the airlock now. Varric nodded. Yeah. And now, they'll come at you harder. Kayseri met Ronan's gaze. Then we hit first. Ronan grinned. Damn right. The Black Star was fully repaired, stocked with supplies and armed for war. The bounty still loomed over them, but something had changed. Kayseri wasn't just running anymore. She was choosing to fight. As Ronan ran final checks, Kayseri stood beside him, watching the stars outside the viewport. Do you regret it? She asked. He glanced at her. Regret what? Saving me. Ronan huffed. You kidding? This is the most fun I've had in years. Kayseri laughed, a real, unguarded sound. She turned to face him fully. I never got to choose anything before. You're choosing now. She nodded. And I choose this. I choose to fight. Ronan's smirk softened into something else. Something real. Then let's make some trouble, he said. Kayseri held out her hand, not as a plea, not as a question, but as a promise. Ronan didn't hesitate. He took her hand, gripping it firmly. The warship still hunted them. The galaxy was still broken. But for the first time, Kayseri wasn't afraid of what came next. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. And with a human by her side, she was ready for whatever came next. The end. For now.